Well, as they said, I am the director of the Kairos Network. We stepped into that about a year ago, and that meant moving 4 times in a year, which is a whole nother story we don't even have time for. But it was on move number 3 of 4 that I ended up back in my old community where I had a ton of relationships, many of which were disconnected people who weren't connected to Jesus or church anywhere. And so to say that my wife and I were excited to be back in that area where we had these deep friendships and we could keep incarnating Jesus in our community was an understatement. And I remember the moment when I'm sitting in my old Starbucks table, I'm sitting there doing my work where I would see people from the community come in and get to connect. And finally, I was back there, and I remember as Tom walked in. Tom was somebody that I knew a little bit through kids' sports and the bus stop. And I remember when I'm sitting there at my table, Tom turns around, and he goes, "What are you doing here?" Maybe it was a mistake that we moved back. He looked at me and he goes, "I was just thinking about you last week, because I was thinking about going to church." See, Tom had been going through a really hard time in his life. And I looked at him and I said, "That's why we came back. That's why I was so excited." And I said, "Hey, we go to church every single week. Come with us." And what I found out was Tom was not ready to go to church. But Tom looked at me and he said, "Hey, do you want to go for a run together?" This is what you need to know about Tom. At this point, this is my friend Tom, he was training for the Austin Marathon. He wasn't just training, he was training to break 4 hours. And if you're sitting in the back of the room going, "Matt doesn't really look like a runner," you would be right. I'm somebody that used to run, but in case you're still not convinced of that, 5 months before Tom asked me if I wanted to go on a run, I did a 5K with my oldest son, who was 8 going on 9 at the time. And he beat me. Now I know what some of you parents are thinking. You did that thing where like dad's coming to the end and I slowed down a little bit so he could cross the finish line and boost that confidence. No. I lost sight of him after the first half mile. He beat me by 3 minutes. And as I crossed the finish line, my kids are cheering and my wife is like, "Yes, you didn't die." So clearly when Tom wants to go on a run, he's not as interested in the run, and it was confirmed when at 5:20 in the morning, Tom comes running by my house, and we spend the next 40 minutes in a spiritual conversation where I was a very good listener because I was focused on breathing and keeping up with Tom. See, what Tom needed was a different way. And the reality is, Tom's not so different than many people in our culture. In fact, when I say Tom, you're probably thinking of your own Tom. In fact, there's this missiologist, Alan Hirsch. And Alan Hirsch has said for the last decade that the way we do church only connects with 40% of our culture. Not that 40% is going, because we would think that's amazing, but that just from how we've structured being the church, only 40% of people would resonate with that, meaning we leave 60% of people out of the equation. Now, at first, I just thought that was Alan Hirsch making up statistics to sell books. And then I saw this study from Barna in 2022. Barna in 2022 did a research project looking at people visiting transcendent or sacred spaces. And what they found out when they were looking at people who were visiting transcendent or sacred spaces, if they looked at all U.S. adults, only 31% of U.S. adults would regularly visit or would be interested in going to a sacred space. 14% aren't sure if they've visited one or not. I still think that's funny. and 55% would never walk into a sacred or transcendent space. Now, what's really sad to me about this study is they moved the research over and they said, well, what's it look like for self-identified Christians? It didn't change much. 49% of self-identified Christians said they would not step into a sacred or transcendent space. And so we hear that, and what do we think? Okay, they're not interested in church, so they're not interested in who? Jesus. But in 2023, Barna did a research project, and they found out there's actually an intense spiritual hunger in our culture. In fact, they looked at every generational bracket from Gen Z to millennial to Gen X to boomers. And what they found out is 77% of Gen Z, 76% of millennials, 77% of Gen X, and 79% of boomers believe in God or a higher power. And 73% of Gen Z, 77% of millennials, 77% of Gen X, and 72% of boomers actually want to grow in their faith. So what that tells us is it's not that they're not interested in the church, so they're not interested in Jesus. They need a church that actually goes out to where they are. A church where people know how to share Jesus in the pews and on a run. And so as we think about that, we think, okay, they need a different way. But does that mean we have to invent something new and different that we've never done before? Well, this may shock you. I actually found the different way when I was reading a really good book recently, the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, chapter 11, you see the story of the church being birthed in Antioch. Now, for those of you that don't know, Antioch was the first major Gentile center of the church. It's the first place that we were actually called Christians. And the story is interesting because the only reason the church started was because of persecution. And so you have these average, everyday, unnamed Christians who are on the run because of persecution. And it says in Acts 11, 19 to 21, those were scattered because of persecution that arose over Stephen. And they went as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch spoke to Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. Now, what stuck out to me in this was these words that you see, speaking, preaching. And you know what's interesting about those? Words create worlds. And we see these average, everyday Christians, and they're talking about the gospel. And then all of a sudden, when they look at the Hellenists, it says that they started preaching. So what picture does that give you? Well, it gives you the picture of this guy, right? So maybe you get this picture that all of a sudden they're talking and they're like, I think this guy's interested in Jesus. Somebody go find Pastor Matt. He'll come in here and he'll preach, and then they will be saved. That's what we think. But how weird would it be for you to stand in the coffee shop, find out your friend's interested in Jesus, and go, wait right here. I'm going to get my pastor. Actually, I think if we translated this differently, it would be more helpful. You can actually translate that word, announce, proclaim, or told. And it starts to make sense now, doesn't it? See, now all of a sudden you get a picture of people doing what you do when you move. They're meeting the people that they live around. They're sitting there, and all of a sudden you're meeting those new neighbors, and you invite them over for a barbecue, and they're looking at you, and they say, oh, what made you move to the area? Did you get a job transfer? Did you retire? Persecution? Really? Political? Ideological? No, I believed in this guy named Jesus, and so they kicked me out of where I was living, and now I'm here, but Jesus is amazing. Well, why are you telling me about Jesus if you just got kicked out of the last place you were living because of Jesus? Because let me tell you something, he is that good. And the church grew like wildfire. It grew like wildfire because average, anonymous, everyday Christians learned how to talk about the gospel in everyday spaces. And it changed everything. All of a sudden, if you learn how to talk about the gospel in everyday spaces, you're going to connect with people that would never come into a church building. People like Tom, who desperately need Jesus, but they aren't ready to make that step into the church. What you're going to find if you do that is you're going to find you're starting to share the gospel in really unique communities. Communities you would never expect to see the gospel moving and spreading. And when you share in those communities, people will meet Jesus where they are. And when people meet Jesus where they are, two pretty incredible things happen. Number one, existing churches will be built up, and new churches will be planted. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this sounds complicated, and it's great for somebody like you, Matt, who has an MDiv. What I'm telling you is when it came to Tom, there was not one thing I needed my MDiv for. I would have been better to get a running coach. Tom doesn't need my MDiv. He needs my relationship. He needs my conversation. And it's something that's so simple, any of us in this room could do it. And that's why at the district, we're actually offering these missionary pathway cohorts so that you can learn how to do this same thing. And so if this is something you're interested in, there's a few cohorts that are going to be starting in the next couple weeks. You can find them right there on the district website. In fact, if you want to scan that while I'm talking, go ahead, and you can find it there. But let me tell you why this is so powerful. Because if you learn to share the gospel in everyday spaces, it takes the pressure off of evangelism. And it takes the pressure off your church. I'll never forget when after 2 months of running with Tom, I was guest preaching at a church. And I was like, maybe I should invite Tom. He said no the first time. He's probably going to say no now, but I'll just invite him. I invited him. Guess who showed up? Tom showed up. Now, I remember in the past when I'd have a friend like Tom that I desperately wanted to know the gospel, and I would share with them, hey, come to church, visit us at church, and they would actually show up. The pressure I felt as a pastor, like all of a sudden I wanted to pull the worship team in and be like, listen guys, nothing weird or crazy. You better be on key because Tom showed up. And that's always the Sunday when Betty pulls out the flags and she wants to dance for Jesus. And you're like, Betty, put the flags away. Tom's here. And for some reason, it's always the Sunday you talk about money. And you feel this tremendous weight because they finally showed up. And this is your one chance to share the gospel. And when Tom walked through that door, I felt none of that pressure. The music could have been awful. Betty could have flag danced. My message could have been terrible. I knew whatever happened on Sunday, Tom and I were going to go for a run on Tuesday. And the next Tuesday after that, and the next one after that. And we would get a chance to keep talking about Jesus. This is the power of sharing Jesus in everyday spaces. And I really believe when I look out on this room that you can do that too. Thank you.